All right, today we're doing quadratic equations. Yesterday we did difference of squares. Today it's perfect squares. All right, perfect square. Here's an example of a perfect square trinomial. It's 16x squared plus 24x plus 9. What makes it a perfect square trinomial is that it's the first thing squared plus 2 times the second thing times the first thing times the second thing plus the second thing squared, which a plus b times a plus b is the same thing as a plus b squared, which will give you that. Okay. If it's minus, if it's a squared minus 2ab plus b squared, you know that both of them are minus. So it's a minus b times a minus b, which is the same thing as a minus b squared. All right. So write this down. 5x squared minus 80. I look and I see, oh, I can take 5 out. So I'm going to factor 5 out before I do anything. Which 5 times 16 gives you 80. And then look, this is the difference of squares, right? Like pretty much this is this lesson is going to be a combination of everything you've learned up to this point. This is different squares. We know how to do different squares. Now you get x plus 4, and then you do x minus 4, which it doesn't reduce anymore, so there's your answer. 9x squared minus 6x minus 35. Okay, you can't take anything out of those because 3 does not go out of 35. So what you try to do is you figure it out. Okay, is it a pattern? Is there a perfect square? Is it different square? There's not. So what you do is you look what would add to give me negative 6 and multiply to give me 9 times negative 35, which is negative 315, right, which would add to give you negative 6, which, right, just to save some time, it's 15 and 21. So I rewrite this as 9x squared plus 15x minus 21x minus 35. And then I solve by grouping. So here, 9x squared and 15x, I can take 3x out. That leaves me a 3x plus 5. So I got to make negative 21x minus 35 into the exact same thing. So that means I got to take out negative 7, which is going to leave me a 3x plus 5. Combine all that, 3x plus 5 and 3x minus 7. And there's the answer. 12x squared plus 5x minus 25. I don't see different squares. I don't see a perfect square trinomial. So I just go to solve it. I look to see what would add to give me 5. Multiply to give me 12 times negative 25. Which 12 times 25 is 300. So what would multiply, which knowing that it multiplies to give me a negative number and adds to give me a positive number, they're going to be opposite signs and the bigger one's going to be positive. So what would multiply to give me 300 and add to give me 5? Anybody? Well, definitely not 1 300. Definitely not 2 and 150. Not 3 and 100. You guys have any ideas? Well, keep going. 5 and what? What would 300 divided by 5 be? 60. 6 would go into, I believe. What would that be? 50. Yeah. Let's just skip to 10. Right? 10 and 30. Still no. Let's try, what's 300 divided by 15? 20. Do we have an answer?
Yeah.
There it is. So 12x squared And I don't want 15 with the 12. You could take 3 out, but I'd rather do the 20. So let's go 20x, and then go minus 15x minus 25. Because I want to take 5s out of the 15 and 25. What could I take out if I solve these by grouping, what we've been doing all week long? What would I take out 12x squared and 20x? 4x. Leave me with 3x plus 5. So I need to make negative 15x minus 25 into that. So Sky, what would I take out of negative 15x and negative 25?
5.
Positive 5 or negative 5?
Negative.
Negative, because you look, it's negative 15x, and it needs to be what? Positive 3x. So how would I change that? I would take out negative 5. So that leaves me a 3x, and then see, I'm changing negative 25 to 5, so I would have to take negative 5 out. Okay. And then you just combine those two. 4x minus 5 and 3x plus 5. And I wrote it in that order so Avery wouldn't get mad. Alright, so now we're solving. Now we're trying to find out what x's make this true. So what I always do is I always want 0 to be, or one side to be equal to 0. So I'm going to add 64 to both sides to get 0 on one side. 9x squared minus 48x plus 64 is equal to 0. Now I can solve, which, just by looking at this, 9x squared minus 48x plus 64, it looks to be a perfect square trinomial. Hey, if you can't just recognize it right off the bat, don't worry about it. I just solve the regular way, but just looking at it, this is a square, that's a square, and this looks like it would be 2 times this times the square root of this, right? 2 times 3 times 8. 3 times 8 is 24, and 24 times 2 is 48. So I'm thinking this is a perfect square trinomial, which it is, so I can figure out what would give me those. So what you do is you take the square root of the first one, and you subtract the square root of the last thing, which is 8. And that's squared, because there's 2 of them. Which you don't have to write both of them out, but I'm going to, just for purposes of notes, you can see what I'm doing. I write them both out, make them both equal to 0, which is the same thing. So really all I got to do is one of them. What would x be? Well, I'd add 8, right? And then I would divide that by 3, so 8/3, which the book just leaves it as that, so x equals 8/3. So that's what would make this a true statement. Here I have a squared plus 12a plus 36. They already solved for 0, so you don't have to do any of that. I look, because I've done this, it's kind of easier to look. This is a square. Is this a square?
Yeah.
What's the square root of this? 6. What would be the square root of this? 1a. What's 2 times 1a times 6? 12a. Right? So is this a perfect square trinomial? Yeah, so I look back at my pattern for perfect square trinomial, and it's just the first thing squared, or square root of the first thing, plus the square root of the second thing. So a plus 6 squared. Set that equals 0. I'm not going to write them both of them out. I'm just going to write out one of them and set it equals 0. So what does a need to be? -6. And there's your answer. Alright, so we're going to talk about square root property. Square root property is something like this, where x squared is equal to 25. So let's say x squared equals 25. I need to figure out what x is. So what I do, to get rid of x squared, I square root it. And what I do to one side, I always do to the other. So x is equal to the square root of 25, but it's plus or minus because it could be a positive number, it could be a negative number. Right? With square roots, you're talking two different answers. So the square root of 25 is 5. So my answer is plus or minus 20 or plus or minus 5. Because positive 5 makes this a true statement and negative 5 makes a true statement. What's 5 times 5?
25.
What's negative 5 times 5? Negative 5. 25. So I can solve something like this based off the square root property. So write this down. So I got y minus 6 squared equals 81. And I can use square root property to get rid of the y minus 6 squared. I can make it, if I square root both sides, I can make this just y minus 6. But what that means is that I've got plus or minus the square root of 81 on the other side. What is the square root of 81? 9. So y minus 6 is equal to plus or minus 9. Because it's both. Both of them make this true. So to get y by itself, I add 6 to both sides. So y is equal to 9 plus 6. And y is equal to negative 9 plus 6. So your two answers are 15 and negative 3. Everybody agree? Okay, and these are what we call roots. They're what makes this a true statement, but it's also, if you were to graph these, it would end up on the, where do these cross on the y or the x-axis? Okay, but you don't really need to know that. What you need to know is how to solve it, and that's what we've done. Here you're given x plus 2 squared is equal to 12. I want to get rid of the square root. All right, so I square root both sides, which gives me x plus 2 on one side, and it gives me plus or minus the square root of 12 on the other. Is 12 a square, perfect square? No. So here's what I want you to do with this. Right? You don't need calculators. I'm not going to make you figure out what square root of 12 is, because if it's almost impossible to do if you don't have a calculator. So instead, what I want you to do, right, is just solve for it. Solve for x, but you leave the plus or minus the square root of 12 on there. So your answer is that right there. Plus or minus the square root of 12 minus 2. Okay, which you want to work out what 12 is, or square root of 12 as you can, but this is much easier to do. Okay? And it doesn't require the use of a calculator. And also, your EOI, right? You get a calculator, but most of the time they're going to leave answers like this. Okay, they leave the radical sign there just to save you one step, to save you having to figure it out. All right. Any questions? Here's your homework assignment for today.